The most inefficient aspect of our food system isn't all the fertilizer or water or labor or chemicals that we use to grow the food that we eat. It's the fact that so much of that food that's produced gets lost or wasted.
25% of all edible produce globally and in the US does not even leave the farm level. It's an incentive problem. And it's also a lack of transparency problem. And technology and innovation can solve both.
That's Full Harvest founder Christine Moseley. And that's right, today we're talking about food waste. It's a huge problem that's not easy to solve. But Christine sees hope in a consumer base whose awareness of the problem is growing.
I think this is just the beginning. I think the next organic trend will be this sustainable rescued trend.
But her vision for Full Harvest isn't just to rescue wasted produce. She wants to digitize the entire produce supply chain in the process.
We want to be the go-to leading online produce procurement solution, and not just the marketplace piece, but solve all of their day-to-day workflow that was previously offline.
Full Harvest Christine Moseley sits down with guest co-host Rishi Pete on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hammerich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, the farmers, the innovators, the investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. Really excited for today's episode with Christine Moseley. This problem of food waste is one I've been really interested in and curious about since really starting this podcast initially. The very first episode I dedicated to the issue was clear back in episode 40 in early 2017, where I interviewed Jonathan Bloom of Wasted Food. It's a book, a documentary, and a blog. Since then, we've had other episodes like people like Olympia Yarger of GOTERRA, Abby Ramanan of, at that time, Impact Vision, Larry Clarke of Nanoguard, and Justin Kamine of Do Good Foods. All of these folks talking about some aspect of food waste and trying to solve it. And if I'm being honest, and with respect to all of these individuals, I'm not sure that the needle has moved in how much of our food, particularly our fresh food, produce, gets wasted each and every year. But I applaud the efforts of every single one of these people, including Christine, who choose to take on such a massive and complex problem. And I think you're going to hear today about some of the reasons the problem is so challenging. But I won't be asking the questions today. I'm very pleased to welcome Rishi Pete back onto the show to host what I believe is his fifth episode, if I counted them all. For any of you who don't already know, Rishi has a lot of experience, particularly in artificial intelligence, supply chain and logistics, product, data and technology strategy, robotics and computer vision, sustainability, and data interoperability. And I know that sounds like a long list, but he has a lot of great experience. He's held leadership roles at Mineral, which is an Alphabet company, the Climate Corp, now Bayer, Amazon, and other tech companies in his career. He's also led 2 startups through exits and 1 through a spin-out. Rishi's also the creator of the free weekly newsletter Software is Feeding the World, which I highly recommend, and will, of course, leave a link in the show notes where you can go subscribe yourself for free. It's always a pleasure to pass the mic over to Rishi, and I appreciate him setting up this interview and hosting it with Christine today. Speaking of Christine Moseley, Full Harvest founder and CEO, is a passionate serial entrepreneur. At age 17, she started a music education nonprofit, Musical Empowerment, which is still growing nationally more than 16 years later. Currently at Full Harvest, she's solving the food waste problem at the farm level with technology. Full Harvest is the first B2B, so business-to-business platform for surplus and imperfect produce, connecting large farms directly to food and beverage companies. Christine holds an MBA from Wharton Business School, and you'll hear a lot more about her experiences that led her to starting Full Harvest. So here's 2 really smart people talking about one of the greatest challenges our food system currently faces. Enjoy this conversation between Rishi Pete and Christine Moseley.
I started Full Harvest after spending 15 years within the supply chain and food industries, where I saw a lot of waste and inefficiency firsthand. I worked at Maersk for 5 years, world's largest supply chain shipping company, in their management training program, rotated around in their Fortune 100 organization and learned a lot of best practices, but again, saw a lot of supply chain waste. And then after business school, I helped scale one of the first green juice companies in the US in New York, and loved what they were doing in terms of healthy food and sort of the tip of the spear for the early organic plant-based food movement. But I was frustrated that they were selling $13 green juices, and that wasn't really affordable to most people. And even more interesting was that the reason for that cost was because they were paying top dollar for perfect looking produce to then just immediately process it. At the same time, things were being done with paper and pen. We were throwing out a lot. So I've been an entrepreneur throughout my life since I was young, always looking for big problems to solve, and just saw so many issues in the food supply chain and not a lot of innovation or even investment or entrepreneurs starting companies 10, 11 years ago. It's been amazing to see the changes since, but decided that I wanted to start my next big business on solving for making the healthy food supply chain more affordable, sustainable, and efficient. And then from there, unpacked these shocking food waste statistics that had just come out. And what stood out to me was that there were tens of billions of pounds of produce being wasted on farm every year in the US alone. And it was just because they weren't perfectly shaped for grocery stores, and could not understand how that was not going into the green juices that we were making to make them more affordable and healthy. And so started Full Harvest to solve that problem. Sort of the aha moment was when I went to one of the largest farms in the country to see if this is really true, and saw that they were only harvesting about 25% of these big, beautiful romaine heads just to package the romaine heart in plastic for grocery stores, and letting up to 75% of this edible food fall to the ground and being stepped on and churned back into the ground. And could not understand why, in times of drought, climate change happening, people going hungry, how we were wasting more than we were actually harvesting and not leveraging that, especially with the plant-based food movement. And that was the moment I said, I was going to make this my life mission to create a world with 100% full harvests, where everything that's edible goes towards consumption.
Oh, that's a very interesting story. 75% wastage. That sounds crazy. I mean, I can't think of any other process where so much gets wasted. Could you talk about that experience a little bit more? Like, what were the growers thinking about, the farmer who was wasting 75%? I mean, how do you run a business like that? And what avenues were they trying to find for that produce that was getting wasted or left behind?
Yeah, and I want to be very clear that farmers are, some of the hardest working, most important people in society, and they're not doing anything that us as consumers are not dictating. So the problem actually starts with us as consumers. We've been in a time of abundance the last decade or two. We've gotten pickier and pickier, more affluent, and that demand for perfection has trickled down to retailers that have gotten more and more consolidated over time, more and more purchasing power. And that has dictated what farmers do so that they can make money and stay in business. And so when about 10 years ago, a lot of the large retailers were taking advantage of just rejecting loads on a dime, just because one little piece of it wasn't perfect, farmers kind of had, were fed up and said, okay, well, fine, then we're just not going to do anything unless it's absolutely perfect. And I've almost experienced what I would call, where they seem almost brainwashed, where they can't comprehend that, we would want to buy a romaine head that is perfectly edible and beautiful. It's just slightly cosmetically twisted, because they're like, well, it's not perfect, but it's totally edible and can be used for other things. So the example I gave was around romaine and what I saw. And romaine is one of the worst offenders. On average, they now have studies. The Santa Clara University did a Santa Clara food waste report 3 years where they've measured in the field. And on average, about 65% of romaine does get wasted in this country. It wasn't as much as the 75% that I, was guessing when I saw it, but this is factual and measured. And there's other big outliers like berries and outside celery stalks. But because of these outliers and just the general waste on farm, they've now found that the average, not only in the US with certain 3-year studies, but also globally, is 25% of all edible produce globally and in the US does not even leave the farm level. And to unpack that a little bit, I already mentioned the consumer demand part of things. We want perfection. So retailers are like, we just want the perfect romaine heart in the middle, or we just want the perfect celery heart in the middle. What there's zero education on, because we're so far removed from our food supply chain, is that every time you go into a grocery store and you buy something that looks perfect and it's the middle and it's bagged in plastic, or even a watermelon that's chopped up perfectly in a plastic container, you're wasting every single piece of that produce that you do not see. It goes completely to waste. So, I say that farmers markets are amazing because you can go and buy the whole head. There needs to be education awareness to purchase full product and not get these convenient sort of whittled down pieces, because then all the byproduct is wasted. Happy to dig into more examples, but I think that's like a really, big one.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And I think the other thing which I found interesting is my understanding, having grown up in India, was at least in sort of developing countries, a lot of the food waste happens because of supply chain issues and maybe less on the consumer side. And my sort of mental model before I started doing research for this was, in countries like the US, a lot of the food waste happens on the consumer side. We just throw away food because we buy too much. But even that doesn't seem to be entirely true based on this discussion. So what was your solution? Like, how did you go about, you talked about sort of the juices and things like that, but how did you go about creating demand for that 2/3 or whatever large number of percentage of produce which is getting wasted in the field?
Yeah. So just to touch on what you just said, the reason why it can seem multifaceted is there's really two buckets of main ways that food is wasted, and we're only trying to solve one of them, not the other. One is mostly in developed countries, which I'll explain more how it's slightly been debunked recently. But in developed countries, it's mostly about demand and being in abundance and affluence and people being pickier and pickier, creating this demand for perfection that causes the imperfect to go to waste. And then there's a lot of surplus that goes to waste, because I would just say across any situation, because we're up to 96% offline for $1 trillion produce market. And so because of that, there's not any transparency on what's going on, what's really available. And so because of that, people don't know how to demand or purchase or forecast and plant properly, right? So there's a lot of surplus. So that's one thing. And the second bucket is supply chain issues, right? I lived in Africa for 2 years. You were in India. That's more in developing countries where they don't have the right infrastructure. And because of that, there's a cold chain storage problem and there's waste that way. And that's not a problem we're solving, right? So we're very focused on the first one, which is mostly focused towards developed countries. That said, the Driven to Waste report by World Wildlife Fund and Tesco a couple of years ago that came out, that was so helpful because it validated in so many ways everything we've been saying for over 8 years. It confirmed that food waste is the number one contributor to climate change, which was only discovered, in the last 5 years or so. But it also debunked the fact that it's not consumers that is the largest portion of the food waste problem. It's actually on-farm food loss. So that was huge for us a couple of years ago. And then also in this report, it talked about the fact that 1/4 of all edible produce is wasted globally. And that even though there's sort of this myth around developing countries not having on-farm food loss because they're efficient, they actually said that they also do a lot of on-farm food loss as well. So I think generally it's just a massive problem that there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of hearsay of, I think because we're so far removed from our supply chain in food and agriculture, where people think, well, why would farmers do that? That's not efficient. Why would they not sell it? That makes no sense. I don't believe it. But at the end of the day, they're very strapped for time, money, and resources. They're focused what little time and energy and resources they have on where the demand is and what they can do. And everything else, usually goes by the wayside. And so the solution is that really what I found when I discovered this problem is it's an incentive problem. And it's also a lack of transparency problem. And technology and innovation can solve both. And so at the time, when I started Full Harvest 9 years ago, Airbnb was in its heyday. Prior to Airbnb, there was no transparency about what extra space was available. And so this perfectly valuable real estate went, by the wayside. You put it online, people realize, and then you create, $1 billion market of this excess inventory. Why could that not be a way to solve for this even more critical excess food problem of allowing people to understand where there was this perfectly edible food or cheaper and to hit, ESG goals, but just be able to see it and understand it and know it's there and purchase it, especially, like I said, with the market growth opportunities. So came up with the fact that the solution in my mind was a B2B marketplace to bring the produce industry online for the first time ever. And over 8 years, we've seen that not only is this something that's absolutely critical to do to bring this industry online for the first time ever, but as we're scaling it and at scale, this can solve a myriad of problems that the industry is currently facing just by bringing it online.
Yeah, I think I want to maybe go to like, what was the process like? Maybe a couple of stories from early days. Like, how did you convince people? I think one is just saying this is a problem and you have a solution. And I think it's critical to find demand for that 2/3 of the product which was getting wasted, right? So how did you what was that initial experience like? And what are the other things that you did? I mean, tech is one thing. Maybe there are other things that you did on the product itself which was getting wasted.
Yeah. Well, just like any company, you start with, just an idea and a vision and a lot of grit and persistence. And I think I talked to everybody I possibly could about this. And, sometimes you only start with one customer, right? And literally for the first few months, we had one buyer and one supplier. And for a couple months, I held my breath every week, whether this was going to all fall apart any day, and then just built from there. But I kind of call it the Bill Gates approach of sort of fake it till you make it. It's like, you've got to tell the buyer that you've got the supply lining up, and you got to tell the supplier you got the buyer lining up. And then, you got to hope and pray that it comes together in the right way and just make it happen. And that's sort of how I did it to get going. But, I showed up the first day ever. It was with a juice company and with a very open-minded, innovative grower that I was very grateful to have met, kind of younger generation that was taking over and loved the concept of being more sustainable. And, it was an experiment. The first year we did mostly innovation only with growers, where we would go and walk the field and tell them we have buyers that would purchase if you just harvest it, and no inventory risk. We'd come to you with the orders just if you, align on this spec and process. And showed up the first day ever and didn't know what was going to happen. And it was like 6 a.m, the sun was rising, and it was in Oxnard. And they went through the field and did what's called concurrent picking, where they put, the plastic crates for retailers and harvested the leafy greens for the retailer, where it was the inside leaves. And then they followed back around and pulled the outside leaves into our Full Harvest cardboard boxes. And our first day, we shipped off 750 pounds of what looks like actually really beautiful edible produce that would have been left and thrown down onto the ground and wasted. And that went off to this juice company. And so, that was like officially the first full harvest, if you will. And we still to this day do our innovation grade, where we help truly innovate with the growers to capture product that would have gone to waste. But now we've scaled to the whole market to incent growers by these buyer opportunities that we bring to them or that they can see online. So from there, I think, you just take one step at a time and you build from there. I think, like I said, there were a few crazy examples with this innovation where people were just stuck on, what do you mean somebody would buy this? Like, it's too big or too small. And you kind of had to get them over that mental hump of, well, do you want to sell it to me or not? Because I have people that will buy it, So I think it's just getting them out of that mindset, and then the world kind of opens up.
No, I think I love this story for a couple of reasons. That one, you actually showed up in the field and, walked the shoes of the grower and in their shoes, basically, and showed them that there was demand. And I think you have real numbers on sustainability. Like a lot of people I talk to, they paint this big picture, but you can actually measure saying, hey, we saved so many gallons of water or so many pounds of.
We know because we innovated it ourselves, you know?
Yeah. So I think that's a great example. If 96% or whatever the high percentage of the market is offline and tech can help, do you see adoption of tech happening? And if yes, what can be done to sort of accelerate that adoption so that the numbers are flipped? Most of it is online and some is offline.
Yeah, I think we're at a really exciting time. The average farmer's age is about 64 years old, and there's a huge wave of transition that's going to be happening over the next few years, and it's already started, of the next generation taking over, which all of us grew up, with the internet, at least, in high school and beyond. And so I think this is going to be sort of a non-negotiable. We've also already heard that it's very challenging for some of these ag companies or big food companies to attract talent from the younger generation because it's so offline, right? And they're desperate for good talent. So I think it's even we've heard from some of our buyers that it's been a great incentive for, the younger talent that they're trying to acquire. I think that adoption actually has not been nearly as difficult on the ag side and farm side that people assumed. It all goes back to psychology and habit change and incentive, right? If you have something that's a no-brainer that is very valuable to them and it's more or less free, there's not much to object to, right? And when these farmers are really struggling for sales, and you're basically telling them you have a free sales force and you're experts on selling product that they didn't previously have a market for, it's almost like, what's the catch, right? And so we have farmers that we have significantly improved their bottom line that absolutely love us and have told us they've had some of their best financial years ever, or that helped them through the pandemic. And I think that's really important to understand because, I've been watching the food and ag space for over a decade. I think a lot of people come into the space where they think they can just build a product and shove it down farmers' throats, but charge for it. I've been very sensitive about not charging suppliers as much as possible because I know that they're so strapped for cash and I don't want to be another risk or another cost center, right? And so I feel like we try to be very thoughtful about supporting the farmers. That's why I started this, is to help them as part of it. I think that has helped adoption on the posting and responding side of things. That said, I view us somewhat more like companies like Tesla, where we're insanely disruptive. No one has done this at all whatsoever before. We're years and years ahead of anybody else on the tech, given our first mover advantage, starting 8-9 years ago. And it's a journey, right? And, it's not a matter of if, but when this is going to happen, and it's all going to be online, because at the end of the day, I say, is this critically needed? Yes. Can't see an argument against it. Is this going to happen? Well, I can't really imagine in 2050 that we're buying and selling produce still with fax machine when we've got AI running the world, right? So if it's critically needed, it's going to happen and it touches everybody on the planet. It's just a matter of when is somebody going to bring this industry online? And we're years and years ahead of anybody else. And so we truly believe it's going to be us after this $1 trillion market. And that said, we've got early adopters that are really excited and leveraging it already. We've got mid adopters and late adopters, just like any disruption, right? And so the key that we're attacking every day, because we truly believe it's not a matter of if, but when, is being there and turning the dials to get this industry online as the industry morphs over the next few years, so that we are there when it's ready. And we are doing a lot every day to increase engagement. And our goal is to get late adopters as soon as we can to really use technology for the first time.
Yeah, I think you mentioned incentives to change, right? That's a big thing. If I don't have the incentive to change, I won't change. And that's true for anything in life. So how is the process different for somebody who is not using tech like Full Harvest versus using tech like Full Harvest, right? What's the difference? And what is my incentive? What value are you bringing to the table for me to switch and change how I behave?
Yeah. So we have, sometimes I say almost too many benefits in a way, because we help solve so many issues. So on the buyer side, we can save up to 95% of time because the alternative is, spending days or hours calling and texting people and waiting for responses. And sometimes it's very stressful to sit around and wait and not know if you're going to hear back or when you're going to hear back, right? We solved that with a marketplace that 24/7, even outside of working hours on your phone or laptop, you can literally see logging in transparently what's going on in the market, right? You can literally be empowered to do that. So that's a game changer. So we save up to 95% of your time because within less than 60 seconds, you can go and source all your produce. And this is also game changing. The last year and a half, we are the first to really bring on full end-to-end logistics booking through logistics technology. So you can, within a few clicks, book your produce as well as full truckloads and check out. And then from that, we also save on the sustainability produce side of things up to 10 to 30% off because it's surplus or imperfect, which is huge if you are open to that. And then for the rest, it's definitely cost savings because of the operational efficiencies, right? You are spending minutes on things versus hours or days. You can do a lot more. We've heard lots of ancillary impact where the cost savings has helped them focus on other things that brought them additional revenue. They've, maybe been able to save on some, not needing to hire more people. And then I've even heard that because we're essentially 100% direct from farm, which is like absolutely game changing as well, because only 10 to 15% of the industry right now is direct from farm. So it's kind of not intuitive, but even though it's surplus and imperfect, it's actually fresher and faster sometimes because it's not sitting in a warehouse for 4 or 5 days. So we've had people where, our rejection rate is like sometimes 1% or less versus like the average 10% because of that. And so you're saving money, you're getting sustainable produce that's edible and beautiful, and it's direct. So I think that I could go on for the buyers, but we have tools to manage their day-to-day stuff that also helps with a lot of pain points that technology can help. On the supplier side, I think it's obvious, but that we help them with incremental revenue, which is one of their biggest pain points, and also meet their ESG goals. So there's a lot there, but those are kind of the key value adds to incent them to come online.
No, I think that makes sense. And you mentioned earlier that, you want to keep this free for suppliers. And obviously you are trying to run a business here. You're not running a nonprofit. So how do you make, if suppliers get it for free, how does Full Harvest make money and fund its R&D exercise and expansion, all of that, right?
I think that's the beauty of and win-win-win of like working with sustainable produce, right? It would have otherwise gone to waste usually. So, you're definitely having a margin, just like any marketplace, but then you can still with that save the buyer money and make the supplier money. So on that side of things, the quick answer is that we take a take rate, just like any B2B marketplace. I think that the other beauty of B2B marketplaces is that you have the ability, once you've built the really hard foundation, to very quickly, with minor additions, start adding multiple revenue streams. We've already started in the last couple of years. So now we have technically 3 total revenue streams, and we plan to get to 6 over the next couple of years. And one of those is that we've started what's called innovation services, where when massive companies like Mondelez and Danone and Dole have come to us and basically told us that they looked everywhere in the world and we were the only company that they could find to help them create a scalable, sustainable supply chain with produce to create products around it for consumers. About 5 years ago, we created the world's first verification for verified rescued produce, with integrity, where because of our innovation I mentioned earlier, for the first time ever, and the fact we're direct from farm, can verify whether the produce would have actually gone to waste or not, tie it to 100% ESG, water and emission savings, and then have that on their dashboards with purchasing and selling, as well as now we have really amazing co-branded products on shelf with top global food companies, which is, almost like the Intel Inside kind of thing, where we have our Full Harvest Verified Rescue Produce seal on the product, and they are delicious, healthy, affordable, sustainable, which I know in food, they say you can't have all 4 things. We're kind of trying to debunk that because, I think this is just the tip of the spear too on this whole upcycled and rescued food movement. And we're the engine and supply chain to help companies make that happen now.
Yeah, I think maybe we can just double click on, looking online, and I found this Too Good. And I think maybe that's what you were referring to earlier. Maybe for the sake of the audience, if you could talk about that, because that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, no, with Danone, they approached us, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. It was a fantastic partnership. They're the world's largest certified B Corp, so a lot of values alignment there. And we worked together. They came to us about wanting to create a SKU line around sustainable inputs. So we created the first ever yogurt leveraging verified rescue produce only. And so their Too Good line, there was a line extension called Too Good, Good Save that, we still have. I know they're working on some stuff there with rebranding, but I think all under the Too Good line total now. We have 4 different SKUs that we've created with them, and they're on shelf right now. So if you just look for any Too Good Danone yogurt that has Full Harvest verified rescued on it, it's got 100% sustainable produce in it. And I swear I'm not biased because everybody else says this. It's their favorite yogurt out there because I think we've made like some fantastic flavors, and it's like 2 grams of sugar. So that's just one example, but I think this is just the beginning. I think that the next organic trend will be this sustainable rescued trend. So I'm excited to see how this evolves, but we've got, other projects that we're talking to people and working on that you'll be able to see more soon.
Yeah, maybe just last few questions here. So you mentioned that maybe today only 10-15% of the procurement is direct from farm in some cases. And so you have people in the middle, the brokers, the distributors, and I'm sure they bring some value to the table, otherwise they would not be there. And if that number from 10 to 15%, it goes up and you are taking on some of that, you're being in the middle, it looks like you're bringing some of that value much more efficiently to the process of buying and selling produce in a B2B scenario. Like, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I've heard over and over again, and even in a working group during the pandemic when, there were top farms and CPG companies and retailers on the phone, I was a fly on the wall, but it was almost like a marketing conversation for Full Harvest, because I think the key thing is that we unfortunately will continue to have supply chain disruptions like we experienced during the pandemic with climate change. And when you have a broken system and something puts pressure on that, it becomes more broken, right? And that's why we saw even more waste and even more people going hungry. And so what I heard was people just desperate for data and insights and transparency, where literally people were looking at Open Table to see if there was like any indication of demand from people, and sitting around calling around, with PDFs of like, do you have this? Do you want this? Just given the urgency, and farmers realizing that they had really leaned in almost too much on certain industries like food service and needed to diversify. And so I think that what that's showing is that like we need a new, solution. You could technically say we're in the middle and that we're transacting almost like a Priceline or an Airbnb or something, but the goal is actually to remove the opaqueness of what the distributor model has created, and to, for the first time in a really long time, put the power back into the buyer and supplier's hands. Right now, they feel like they are, either being gouged or like in the dark, or it's just at the mercy of these distributors and brokers. And we want them to feel like they're getting the control back. They can actually see what's going on and make their own business decisions and do what they need to do with their supply chain, with us helping in the middle. So we're almost like the world's first, I feel like, online produce distributor, or like ghost distributor, because we don't own assets. And we truly believe, though, that by leveraging strategic partnerships and using technology, that we can have more direct from farm of a supply chain and not leverage assets as Full Harvest ever, in terms of owning it ourselves.
Yeah. And I think as part of research for this episode, I saw that, I think it was last year, you guys expanded to all grades of produce, I think sometime early last year. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah.
Because I would love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah. So just to recap, the reason we spent the first many years as experts and pretty much only selling surplus and perfect produce was because we wanted to be experts on this, white space, and because there was so much value creation there. But what we learned pretty early on is that as I mentioned before, the technology that we were building was critically needed, and we were actually building it for the hardest part. And so there was little to no tech improvement that we needed to make to scale it to the whole market. It was just literally people putting different SKU names or grade names. And so we had also the learning that over time that we could have the win-win-win of going after the $1 trillion global food market or produce market and solve the on-farm food loss problem faster by going after the whole market. Because as I mentioned, it was not just an incentive problem, it's also a transparency and data problem where you need that data and transparency of the whole market of what's going on to be even more efficient on buying and selling and matching to sell more. And also kind of the sales force approach, you want to be able to be a one-stop shop. You don't want to just be focused on a small niche part of their business, or else they'll need multiple solutions, right? So a year ago, after having this plan and building towards it for a few years, we scaled to the whole market so that we can be a one-stop shop for all of our buyers and suppliers, because they all buy and sell all grades. And the goal is now, we want to be the go-to leading online produce procurement solution, and not just the marketplace piece, but solve all of their day-to-day workflow that was previously offline. So our goal is just truly to digitize the produce supply chain for the first time ever and revolutionize the produce sale so that it's just elevated in so many ways and solving a lot of the unnecessary problems that the industry is currently facing.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, having worked with grocery retailers a lot in the past, they can be an interesting bunch to work with. But if you can provide good value to them, I think you can really drive a lot of change for them. Maybe last question here, given that this is the Future of Agriculture podcast, I'm going to ask you to maybe look a couple of years down the line. Let's say you can pick how many number of years, 4, 5, 1, 2, whatever. How do you think the things in the produce industry would have changed a couple of years down the line?
Yeah, this will be fun to listen back. Well, I'll say in terms of full harvest and our solution, and then I'll kind of talk more broadly, but our vision is that in the next 5 years, we have digitized the supply chain and people can't even remember the days and can't believe that they were doing things offline with paper and pen or blindly without data and insights. And that because of it, we've created a world with, we say 100% full harvest, so trying to push for as close to that as possible, where we just see a lot of less waste and inefficiency. And we prevent a lot of inflation because of, you think inflation's bad now. Imagine when, we're running out of even more land, water, and resources, the price is going to be even higher. And my hope is that full harvest can prevent, what I jokingly call sort of the toilet paper effect during the pandemic, where I think if we're not thoughtful and proactive of bringing more supply to the table, we will run out of time with soil and availability of land and labor and water. And there will be, sheer panic on the supply chain and pricing and things going through the roof. So we're trying to prevent that world. So my hope is that doesn't happen, or at least it's wildly, extended. And so that's my hope. And I think you'll also see a lot more upcycled and rescued items on shelves. I think that will be a huge trend. And then separately, I think I'm really excited by the automation of robotics and things in the ag space. From early days, walking fields 8-9 years ago, saw that desperate need for that with lack of labor, and just, have always been a huge cheerleader for that side of things, given that I think it's absolutely critical. And I think that with, the advent of this automation and robotics in the field, they will be able to harvest more, and then we can help them sell even more because it'll be easier to track and sort or proactively understand what's going on. So those are a few things I'm excited about and hopefully unfold.
All right. Well, that is a great place to end today's episode right there. Thank you so much to Christine Moseley for being on the show. You can go learn more about all the work she's doing at fullharvest.com. As always, link will be in the show notes for that. Thanks as well to Rishi Pete for hosting another great episode. I'll really appreciate his efforts. Learn more about what he's doing at Metal Dog Labs or Software is Feeding the World. I will link to both of those as well. This topic of food waste is one we probably probably don't discuss enough, but as I said at the top of the show, we've done a few episodes in the past. Really want to dive deeper into the nuances of this topic, so if you have good stories, you can always let me know on Twitter, LinkedIn, or via email. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.